教授. He will be talking about finding our way toward future Earth, issues, methods, and collaborations. Please also welcome Professor Xiaoxin Huang, Chair of the International Human Dimensions Program on Global Environment Change, National Committee in Taipei, and the Director of the Institute of Sociology at the Academia Sinica.
While Professor Shebe is preparing his fantastic talk and with machine. Nowadays, without PowerPoint, that means you don't have a power, you don't have a point. Now he has a PowerPoint, just like Eric, you have power and point. Let me take this opportunity to introduce Professor Ilan Shebe. He has a very distinguished career, and as you can see from the prepared text, I just point a few to refer to you so that we know where he comes from and what is he going to talk about. Professor Ilan Shebe is a professor and senior fellow at the Institute of Advanced Sustainability Study in Potsdam, Germany, and the University of Stuttgart, that's also in Germany, sociology. So he's my colleague as a sociologist. And you know sociologists usually are very good. A good person, like Ji Jinjie, and among many others. At the Advanced Institute, Professor Shebe collaborated with the individuals groups in the cluster of a global contract for sustainability and the clusters on sustainable interaction with the atmosphere. So nowadays, I think it's very fashionable for sociologists or social scientists, for that matter, to link with the natural science, the earth science. So we have many terms, like just usually very long term, long name, and I think it's good because we are looking for the long term, long name for our future. And also very importantly, let me mention that I met Professor Shebe this past March in London for the IHDP scientific committee meeting where I met him, and so I thought his expertise and knowledge, and also his working on for the next 10 years on learning knowledge for sustainability future is good for Taiwan. So I mentioned that to Professor Tsai Huimin, and she is one of the organizers of this conference. I'm very glad you made it, and you graciously agreed to be here. And IHDP Taiwan, IHDP National Committee Taipei, also we have many co-projects, and one of them is social learning for sustainability, and Dr. Tsai is the coordinator for that. Now, this one I want to mention is Professor Shebe chairs an international 10 years, 2012 to 2022 Research Alliance on Knowledge, Learning, and Societal Change, which I think is exactly the theme of this conference. I'm glad, Professor Zhang, now you are the Secretary General of this Ministry of Education's environmental group. I think he's the golden man. He gives the money. I think you use the money wisely. So this alliance, this group is affiliated with the IHDP headquarters. So I was very glad he's here. And just without talk too much, because you can read this, more importantly, I want to mention this. Professor Shebe is not only a writing, thinking person. He is also action. He's an action people. He made business here. I want to know more about it. He founded for 18 years and run a unique company in Silicon Valley, designing science learning experiences for more than 230 museums worldwide, including Disney Depot at EPCOT. I don't know what is that, but it's educational or something like that. The Science Museum in London and Smithsonian Institute in Washington, D.C., and Mirador in Santiago, Chile. So apparently it's an educational tool for children or for adults. So that is we need a tool to educate ourselves, to learn more about, and so that we can transform those learning knowledge into action to save us and the planet. So Professor Cheby's talk, again, just like previous talks and the future talks for the 2 days are very timely and also relevant. He will talk about finding our way toward future Earth, issues, methods, and collaborations. So please join me to a big hand to welcome Professor Cheby.
Thank you very Hello? Yeah, there we go. Thank you very much for that very kind introduction. And thank you for the opportunity to get together here. I want to suggest some ideas, but particularly as Professor Hopkins mentioned also, this is really, in my view, an opportunity not for me to sort of give a lecture or something, but to set a stage for our mutual learning among all of us. I hope I will learn, I'm sure I will learn from the discussion with all of you and with you involved with each other. I would like to be part of that conversation and simply act as an instigator, a troublemaker, and try to raise some ideas that we can all discuss, which already in the 2 really excellent and thoughtful presentations this morning, and I'm sure in ones that follow, these are the starting points for our thinking, not the ending points. So I really want to emphasize that. I want to also say one other thing with the chairman's agreement that if I am talking in a way or say something that you don't understand, please feel free to interrupt me. And we can also maybe have time at the end for discussion, though I'm not sure, but we can do that over coffee or whatever at another time. But if you don't understand, please let me know. So let me try, there's so much to cover, and I will try to be rather brief, and I will try to leave out so many things around education, which you mentioned, but which in this case I have not put into this presentation, but may touch on tomorrow in talking about one piece of it. So the overall framework, which has already been alluded to, is this idea of living in the Anthropocene, living in a time in which human impact on the planet is of enormous consequence. It is not incidental, it is not local, it is tremendously important, and it is global. Second, that I want to talk as essentially an outgrowth of that, and in this framework of the Knowledge, Learning, and Societal Change and the International Human Dimensions Program in Global Environmental Change, that's part of a larger picture of global change research. And I simply want to bring that into the framework. I don't know, many of you may know about this, but in case you don't, I think it's worthwhile that we sort of have a common point there. And as part of that, it also has been related to the idea of the planetary boundaries, if you will, from the physical and natural science perspective, and the question of human agency, which is fundamental in the idea of the Anthropocene. Then briefly about transdisciplinary research and participatory decision-making, and then a little bit, if I have time, on knowledge, learning, and societal change, per se. So I'm going to step back, if you will, and forgive me for covering ground that you may know very well, but again, it's useful to have common thinking on this. First of all, that science is really fundamentally a part of society and vice versa. It isn't separate, though in past there were lots of discussions as if science were something over here, and it's the mad scientist in the lab who is going to do these strange things, and it has nothing to do with society. Well, that's not the case. It's very much an activity of humans out of our own curiosity fundamentally, and that it's part of the environment and therefore also of the culture. It's also a way of understanding and acting in the world, and it becomes cultural in many ways, which is both good and bad in the sense, or can be bad, in the sense that it is also limited by the culture. And we have to recognize that. It's easy to overlook that in a sense. So the society, the culture, the circumstances of science, of doing science, profoundly affect what science is done and what is done with the science, because it affects what questions do we ask. And as all of us know, the hard part in doing science, doing research generally, is what's the question? If the question is posed poorly, can't get much of anything out of it. If it's posed well, one has a chance at it. But then the problem is, what questions do we ask? What resources are available to answer those questions? And to whom? Who gets the resources to do this? And how is the science and technology that's produced used, and for whose benefit? These things we need to keep in our mind, and one way briefly to summarize this is that if we look at sort of normal science, or science, if you will, up to almost to the current point, though I would say it was already in the 20th century was part of it, it's basically driven by human curiosity, a very wonderful thing. I think a great place to start. And the basic understanding is what we're after. It asks fundamental questions, but it tends to do that in separate disciplines. It's a reductionist approach, and this is, I think, a very critical point. That is that it says that we can look at all the pieces of a problem by themselves, and then we put it all back together afterwards simply as a linear combination of those pieces. And the problems are also framed. The questions and the problems are framed by the researchers and by the scientists only. Minor point that tends to be quantitative with large sets of data. Analysis is done by the researchers. It's not done by anyone else who's involved. And the results are delivered to the stakeholders, to the society at large. So, okay, what's the contrast? Well, we can't afford that kind of science alone. It will continue, and it has great value to us, but we need more than that. We need, as was already just said, in fact, in the last talk by Professor Clark, we need this solution-oriented, and it can be multidisciplinary, transdisciplinary. There are lots of versions of this. It needs to integrate, not to ignore, but to integrate traditional, if you will, disciplinary knowledge. We need that expertise. It has to take into account the context of the application. It's not independent of that. Where and how that is used is critical. And it combines both qualitative and quantitative kinds of measurements and data. And very critically, and I think one of the most difficult issues that we face in this transdisciplinary approach is to really engage with the stakeholders. Who are the stakeholders? One, that's not so easy to define, but broadly, it's anyone who either influences the issue or is affected by it. And yes, there are stakeholders who are not really involved, but we need to make, it's not up to them, it's up to us as researchers to make sure we do think about them and engage them in appropriate ways at different times. And it's also a process then of collaborating with those people. Not just because, yeah, that's a nice thing to do and that's what we call transdisciplinary, but because we will not learn what we need to learn without them. And I can give a very interesting example, quick one, that might resonate with you. There was a wonderful project done, actually there have been several, but I'll mention this one in particular, Surya project in India, northern India, using cook stoves, very efficient cook stoves. They're really beautifully done, designed partly at MIT and working with Professor Ramanathan at Irvine, UC Irvine. And they developed these stoves, wonderful. The point is to reduce black carbon emission, which has huge health effects and problems with air pollution. Great. So they introduced them, people used them, they went away, they came back 6 months later, they looked at the test results. Problem was, yes, people did use them. Two problems came up. They found that in most cases, people continued using the old stove and the new stove. Why? Number one, because now they had two places to cook at once. That was a good thing. Two, they forgot that the new stoves were too efficient and it didn't heat the home. And nobody asked the question to begin with. Nobody talked to the people locally to really find out how do you use the stoves now. So it's not just a matter of, if you will, political correctness. It's a question of whether we even get the problem right. So this becomes critical. I will briefly mention sort of the four large global change research programs now are the World Climate Research Program, which is really responsible for IPCC on climate change, the IGBP, International Geobiosphere Program, which has done a great deal of work in the basic and very crucial work in the natural and biological, natural sciences, including biological, geological, physical characterization of the Earth and of the planet as a whole, and Diversitas, which is largely focused on biodiversity, not too surprisingly from the name, and is now crucial in setting up the IPBEST program that will be, in a sense, a parallel to IPCC on biodiversity. And then the fourth, which is the one that I've been most involved with, is the International Human Dimensions Program in Global Environmental Change. The GEC is Global Environmental Change, IHDP for short. And the point of IHDP is to really look at global environmental issues as social and societal issues, not simply as physical science, natural science, technology, and to frame and integrate social science research with natural science and technology in a constructive way. There are about seven research programs. It's an evolving thing. These tend to be 10-year programs that cycle through. And there are 7 running currently, and the knowledge, learning, and societal change is the most recent. The one prior was the integrated risk governance, which I'm also involved with, but I chair the latter. In the sake of time, I'm going to jump ahead. I think the important point here is that this is changing. And it is changing because the nature of that sort of structure of these programs, it's become clear that we need a much more integrative program and not as separate. But it's also clear that we need some kind of superstructure, if you will, around this, because the question is the synthesis of research from different fields. How do we put these together? How do we look for the gaps in the research? What's the value added of a secretariat? And this has led to, first, the questions have led to a process that the International Council of Science set up, ICSU, starting in 2009, to look at the grand challenges. What are the really large-scale challenges? And they came up with rather generic labels for this: forecasting, observing, confining or mitigating, responding, adapting, innovating, both technologically and socially. But I think the key point can be summarized: how can improved scientific knowledge of the risks of global change and options for response most effectively catalyze and support appropriate actions by the citizens and decision makers. Now, right there is a key point that is implicit but not explicit, and what I'm concerned about is making that explicit, namely knowledge to action. People talk about the knowledge to action gap. Well, there's much more to that story than simply, well, there's a gap there and we just need to pour more knowledge into it. Yes, we need more knowledge, but boy, we better figure out how we get across that gap. We fill it in, and that has lots to do with the way we learn, with the way that both individuals and collectives function and act, as already has been mentioned this morning. There is also another the big gorilla in the room is the Belmont Forum, the International Global Funders Alliance, or something, I forgot, ICFA, set up this Belmont Forum to follow on these major challenges and decide how to spend large chunks of money in a coherent way, rather than getting 23 proposals that are almost the same but not quite, and then how do you fund them, et cetera, but how to put sufficient resources in a coherent way. I'm not sure they've figured that out yet, but that's a side note. But it's the right idea. We're going there. However, I would also say with the Belmont, that has now, in the Planet Under Pressure meeting, it was announced what the first challenges are on freshwater systems and on global, coastal vulnerability. But what I think is in a way missing here fundamentally is that the Belmont Challenge is still formulated in rather classic terms, and they talk about delivering knowledge. And I was personally not happy in seeing the wording in some of this, but hopefully that will change. So we really are going to something which they have called, thankfully, Future Earth instead of another acronym. So we at least have something else to refer to. How this will really play out because of people having a tendency to protect their own sort of domains, but we'll see how that works out. But I think the concept is important. The key points I want to emphasize is transformation. And this, again, has been referred to before very clearly. In many ways, to move towards a sustainable future for all of humanity. And I emphasize the all. It's very easy to get seduced by saying, oh, we're making this great progress over here. And we forgot about much of the rest of the world, or even about people within our own society that we tend to marginalize. We need to really strengthen this integration and the transdisciplinary and action research, plus the traditional multidisciplinary thing. I gave a keynote talk in Zurich at the ETH, the Federal University, and it was a part of the Global Alliance on Sustainability, the 4 major universities. And I was really annoyed and said so, because when I heard discussions about multi and transdisciplinary, what they meant, what many of the faculty there said, oh yes, we do that, that's right. The civil engineers just met with the electrical engineers. Well, wait a minute, there's a problem here.